we'll adjust fire as with whoever we have. So when we go into burns, a couple of different things that we need to think about. One, there are burn calculation formulas. There's ways for getting in and assessing the actual surface area and how much of a threat this may be to an individual. But the biggest thing we're going to look at is what types of burns. And so burns are classified in as far as first, second, and third degree. Now, they use the term fourth degree for electrical burns. I don't like the use of that term because it would imply, if we were to use a progressive scale, if we were to say first, second, and third degree burns, and then somebody said fourth degree burns, you would think, oh, that's the worst it can get, right? You would feel that that would be worse than whatever first, second, or third degree, but it's not. Fourth degree burns is simply just classifying it as electrical, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's any better or worse. So I really hate the verbiage of them using that, and so, you know, go ahead and just lock it into your mind right now that as far as first, second, and third degree is going to be the worst of those. Fourth degree is something else entirely, all right? So, and depending on,
Blast injuries.
what's that?
Kind of like with blast injuries, they have a fourth phase, but that's more like
Yeah.
radiation and toxins.
Right, so blast injury, you normally have your primary, secondary, and then your tertiary and whatever.
Quaternary and
Now they're adding
quinary.
even a fifth one to say that if somebody added a biological weapon in with it. So, yeah, those are getting,
Fourth, though.
what's that?
So weird.
One of them-
Go with the fourth because that's also,
Yes.
it's a whole bunch of things.
Those are
Radiation.
the two right there. Yeah, so they're separating biological things, again. So, like I said, as we go into that, that's just something we kind of need to be aware of. But like I said, we'll actually get into, and we'll talk about some of the calculations as far as the surface area. But when we look at.
In case Bradley doesn't show up.
Oh, okay.
In case Bradley shows up, it's not moving.
And we did,
He has food poisoning.
talk with them as
You got
far
food
as.
poisoning?
Yeah.
So we probably won't see him.
Yeah.
We probably won't see Frank Killebrew from the Region 7 office today. He just texted me, I was confirming, he said he got sick last night. I said, does that mean you're not coming? So I'm thinking probably not. So we may have to push that back to another day.
Well, the benefit is, that means more time for skills in the lab. That means I'll actually get.
And our late day may not be as late as we thought it would be, but break all your hearts, right?
I'll take some extra time.
I don't have to work today, so it's not exactly
Take the whole day off for us? I feel special. It wasn't me here.
Yeah.
All right.
But, we did, I asked them as far as for anything on the test that they felt like, wasn't covered, anything that hit him by surprise. There was one thing he pointed out, but then they all showed him that, he was mistaken, so.
What? Your classmates busted you out like that?
I'm like 30 hours without sleep, so I'm happy for it. Good job, guys.
But yeah, so we just hit on just a couple of things to make sure.
All right, and I was able to print your homework and your homework that you emailed to me. The others of you, were you able to do it online or?
What homework?
What homework?
Come on, here.
Today's your Saturday.
Oh, I did my stuff on Pierce, I did all.
Yeah, I did the Pearson,
So
and then I did that as well.
Well, no, and that, again, that's something we gotta talk about, because I can't get in there and see it on my Brady right now.
Mhm.
I hope I can figure out, or I hope I can get access to, last time I tried to get into Brady, it said I had to get permission from Charlotte to let me see it, so that may or may not happen, we'll see how that works out. But what I told him was, if you weren't able to do it online,
Oh.
just do the questions in the back.
Oh, well then never mind about mine. I thought I was supposed to do both.
Well, I'm trying not to make it difficult on you all, but it's a whole lot easier for me. What you guys did was perfect, because I know I can see it.
How do I email it to you? Do I take a picture of my grade? and
Not the my Brady, the,
How did you
Yeah.
guys email it?
I just use the Outlook, that
Yeah.
we've been using since day one.
the
It's
Columbus Tech
School.
email. The Columbus Tech email.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but I'm saying, like, we'll do it
Just
later.
attach
We not
file.
gonna-
Yeah, I'll
attach
print
a
off
file. I don't know how to send
If you don't know how to send emails, I don't know how to get emails, so we're perfect.
emails.
No, I'm not that bad off.
Hey man, just wrap it to a pigeon and throw it out the room.
I'll
It'll
figure
get
it
here
out.
someday.
I'm not that old, come on.
Smoke signals.
Hey, you got the sign-in roster, so sign in before you guys go to lunchtime?
Another question, do you want all of it, or just the homework, the test? and three tests?
All I really care about is, what you're sending me. What was it, just the questions in the back? Is that
Yeah,
what?
the end review,
Is that-
although it's like paragraph paragraph answers the way they list the questions.
Yeah, so it's just the questions in the back of the book as to any of your
We got
questions.
like 10 pages of stuff for me.
Cause like I said, that my Brady has got me locked out, that I can't get into it, and do anything with it. That may get better, I hope, okay? I'm gonna grade these tests, look over the homeworks that I've got, I will be back in a little while. We'll do this afternoon, Jimmy will finish up whatever he doesn't get done this morning, and then we'll go in the skills lab, okay? And Melissa will be here this afternoon also.
Okay.
Right, so, before we get into the burns themselves, we're gonna talk about the skin for just a second. So, the skin is broke up, we know there's three individual layers of the skin. What's the outermost layer?
Epidermis.
Okay, and what is its purpose?
Temperature control, general protection from the outside,
Pretty much, that's it. It's the outermost layer, it's just that outer protection. What's below the epidermis?
dermis.
And what happens within the dermis?
I mean, it holds all your oils and glands and stuff like that. It also holds your follicles.
Yeah, so the dermis is that's the main functioning level of the skin. Remember that the skin is actually an organ. It's the largest organ in the body. And the dermis is the layer that's actually performing all the functions, okay? That's where your hair follicles are gonna come from. That's where the sweat glands are located. That's where, as far as everything, when we have a response to our skin, that's where everything takes place. What's below the dermis?
Subcutaneous,
Alright, and what's the purpose of that?
nerve,
That's where blood vessels travel through.
The insulation, so when we get down to that deep, that's normally where fatty tissue, things like that are gonna be located, and so one of the big benefit of that's gonna be insulation. So we've got the epidermis, that's our outer protective layer, we've got our dermis, that's our functioning layer, that's gonna have, like we said, everything within it, and then we've got our subcutaneous tissue, that's where the fatty tissue is, that's our insulating layer. Some people have more subcutaneous tissue than other people do.
that's why second degree burns hurt worse.
So, as we get into first degree burns, so first degree burns, we'll start with those. First degree burns, anybody that's ever had a sunburn has had a first degree burn. With first degree burn, all you get is that redness. At the initial time that it occurs and immediately afterwards, we don't get blisters with it. With those, it is possible to get a blister, they can develop afterwards, but primarily first degree burns are classified as not having blisters, and it's just gonna be that pink color. So with that, all we've done is we've damaged that outermost protective layer of skin, okay? As we move into second degree burns, that's when we start to get into what we call partial thickness. That's where it actually starts to get down below that outer protective layer. Once it gets down into there, that's where we're really agitating the tissue. And as far as the most painful, yes, that's where the second degree burns is where we're gonna get the pain, because the nerve endings are still there and they're still functioning, but there's lots of tissue damage, and so there's lots of irritation on it. The other thing we have to start thinking about is that once we get down into second degree, once we start having damage, that we're now down into the functional level of the skin, we're down into the dermis, the more severe those burns are, the more we can start to lose the function of that. So as we progress through and we get all the way into a third degree burn, if we've got a full thickness burn, we have destroyed the tissue that at the level that it actually would perform any function. So what functions do we lose if that tissue's damaged? Okay, so we've lost the outer shell for the infection, but we can have that with it just going through. We can run the risk of infection even at a second degree burn. So by the time we get to the third degree, what functions are we losing though?
Motor function, feeling, sensation.
Okay, well, we're losing feeling and sensation because the nerve endings are damaged. So,
Temperature control
temperature regulation. How does your skin regulate temperature?
in the third layer of the skin.
But how? How does skin
Shivering.
regulate? What's that?
Shivering.
So shivering isn't done actually at the skin level. Shivering is done,
Right at the top?
that's musculature.
Oh.
So that's actually causing that rapid movement, and that rapid movement, what that does is it, because of the actual metabolization, by the muscles functioning, by them burning up oxygen and fuel, they generate heat. And so shivering generates heat that way. but how does the skin itself regulate temperature?
Fat.
What's that?
Is it fat?
Nope.
I know lifting of the arm hair and body hair and stuff like that helps
Okay,
keep.
so that's one of the things. So what we've got is on the actual hairs, everybody's had goosebumps at some point, right? So goosebumps, that is your body trying to, at the bottom of the hair, you have a tiny, there is actually a tiny connection, a tiny musculature connection that will pull, and it's called like pylorus erectus, I think. But what you get is you actually get it pulls tension and it makes that hair stand up. The reason it does that is when the hair stands up, it's the same thing as like a chicken fluffing up its down feathers, or if we were to wear a puffy coat, it creates that layer of air insulation around us. So when you get those goosebumps, that's the body trying to make those hair follicles stand up. But so the hair, that's one of the things. It tries to hold a layer of air next to us. But there's also another one, there's two other things that the skin does to regulate temperature.
Sweating.
Okay, sweating. Why does sweating make a difference?
It helps you cool down by evaporation.
Okay, so by evaporation, but why? Let's go a little deeper than that. Why does sweat, so if I sweat, my skin constricts down and pushes the sweat out of the sweat gland, pushes moisture out on the surface, and that evaporates. Why does that cool me off? Yes,
Because
it's
it's taking that heat.
Because when the,
Oh, sorry, go ahead. I'll just
I
take
have
one.
no idea, I'm just guessing.
Oh, okay.
When
Well, it takes the heat that's, is basically the heat from your body is actually being
Right,
used
the hot
as energy
water.
to make the water evaporate, which is causing you to cool down.
So,
Does it come out and cool it off with the ambient air?
it's cold weather outside, right?
Right.
All right, if it's cold and dry outside versus if it's cold and wet, you feel it more when it's wet, right? Then what happens if you actually get wet? You feel so much colder, right? Because with that dampness, we can transfer heat through fluid a lot easier than we can from dry skin to air. So the fluid actually facilitates the temperature transfer. It's just everything, just like we say that with wetness on the surface, we can get the membranes will be more semi-permeable. We're gonna actually allow things to be absorbed better if it's wet versus dry. Just the same reason that the moisture inside of our lungs allows us to transfer oxygen over, things like that. All of that is facilitated by that moisture. So when we sweat, the water itself evaporating does carry, as it evaporates, it does carry some of the heat, but it's because it actually transfers the heat more easily. It'll transfer into the sweat much more easily than it will the surrounding air. So the water actually transfers the heat from the tissue. It causes a more rapid heat loss, and then when it evaporates, it leaves the surface. So we've lost that. What's the other way that our body regulates temperature? What is the biggest thing that our body does to regulate temperature? Or our skin, rather. What is the biggest thing that our skin does to regulate temperature? Okay, you're on it. You said blood vessels, but a little more specific.
Raises blood
Oh,
to the
it
top.
constricts
So-
and dilates.
Constricts and dilates at the capillary level. Why does that make a difference?
Whether the blood is
Surface
moving
area.
faster or slower.
So it's not faster or slower. You said the surface area?
Faster.
Okay, so the blood coming, if our core temperature is based on, that's everything, internal organs, that's everything functioning, we know that our skin isn't gonna be necessarily the same temperature as whatever our core temperature is. That's why a lot of these, the scanning thermometers, some of these things are so inaccurate, because our skin can fluctuate in temperature greatly from what our core temperature actually is. So your blood is going to be, because it's going to be part of your central vascular system, it's going to be a much more accurate representation of your core temperature. So if your blood is up on the surface of the skin, it's going to allow that heat to be lost. So that's why when we go out and it's cold, your skin gets cold to the touch, but it'll kind of get that white look. That's because all the blood is being pulled away from the surface, because that's your body trying to keep that blood warm. So the capillaries constrict down and they force all that blood away from there. It'd be the same thing as, if you put a layer on, you're insulating yourself, right? You're putting more distance between your body and the cold air. Well, that's your body putting more distance between the coldness and the blood that's circulating throughout the entire system. you know, we utilize things like that. If we're trying to treat somebody that's got a, environmental injury, if we're concerned about heat exhaustion or heat stroke, one of the things we do is we take cold packs and we put it where? Right where vasculature is close to the surface. We utilize areas on the neck and the groin and the armpits, places that we can get a temperature variance closer to the blood circulation. So your body does that. So it constricts down, it pulls the blood away, or it dilates and it sends more blood to the surface. That's why when in the summertime, if somebody's hot, they get that red flush look to them. It's because their body is trying to cool off, so it dilates the capillary beds, it pushes all the blood out to the surface of the skin, and that facilitates a more rapid heat loss. So all of that takes place within that layer of the skin. So if we lose that, we lose the body's ability to regulate and manage temperature in that area. So initially, if we damage that outer protective layer, we start running the risk of infection, particularly if blisters are busted, things like that, if there's any tear in the skin. As we move deeper, we start to lose that skin function. Now, beyond that, that's when we actually lose the nerves, and number one, you lose the feeling in that area, but depending on how deep that damage goes, you can actually start to lose, you can have loss of use of an extremity because the nerve damage can be so severe. So when we think about, we talked about pain, and we said, oh, second degree burns are gonna be the ones that are real painful. They are, but somebody who has third degree burns is going to be in a lot of pain too. Not from the area necessarily with third degree burns. Those nerves are totally destroyed, but the surrounding area, because it doesn't go from third degree to nothing. Nobody has an isolated, clear-cut line. It's possible, but that's pretty difficult to achieve. And so what we get is we get all that area immediately surrounding it, that they're gonna have that transition. It's kind of like when you look at the thunderstorm map on the Weather Channel, and you see the red, and then there's the yellow, and then there's the green. Right, and so you're gonna get that surrounding tissue that's gonna have the problem with it.
I got second degree and third degree burns on my legs
From
hot grease.
hot grease. So we'll hit on grease, and we'll talk about something specific to grease burns. Well, you know what? Before we move into other degrees of burn, let's go ahead and let's talk about that. So when we're looking at burns, as far as they're trying to think how to keep all this kind of in one flow. Because I don't want to get into all the different types of ways to get burns yet, but regardless of how the type of how the burn occurs, what we need to understand is that the biggest thing we can do is stop that process. We need to initially stop the further tissue damage. If somebody touches a hot, they touch something hot, like a kid puts their hand on the eye of the stove, when they pull their hand away, they've immediately removed their hand from that heat source.
Right.
But if we've had a burn that has heated the skin enough to physically cause damage, there's still heat present. There's a higher than what should be temperature present in that skin, so we need to cool that skin.
Right.
Where this comes into play is things like grease burns, because with a grease burn, you're not removing yourself from that heat source. The heat source is still there, and it is constantly continuing to do more damage. So not only are we now trying to cool the skin off, and we're just trying to stop that localized spread, we still have the actual ignition source, if you would, of that burn is still there doing more damage.
Right. I ran upstairs and I put hot water on it, and I scrubbed it with antibacterial soap, and I was, woo.
So a soap, something like Dawn or Dial, or one of those soaps that could break down it emulsifies the product. It'll actually break down the grease and make it where it's more water soluble. That's good. You do have to be very careful though about scrubbing aggressively on it.
No, I just
Okay.
tried to get it off.
Alright, so since we're on that, hopefully nobody in here, they're old like wives' tale, farm remedies, whatever you want to call it. We went to a grease burn in a restaurant where the employees decided that the appropriate thing was to put mayonnaise all over it. I've heard of people putting butter on wounds, I've heard of people putting mayonnaise on wounds. there's no benefit to any of that. And in fact, you're doing more damage. If you put anything oil-based on there, what you're doing is you're forming an insulating layer over that, and you are not only holding that grease in, but any burn, you're holding the heat in, exactly.
Right.
So even if a kid just touches a hot stove and burns, or they grab a tailpipe or something and burn their fingers, if they put anything on the surface, now, there is something that can be used later on. We can use burn creams to treat afterwards, Silvadene, something like that, something that we can treat for, anti-infection properties, or something that can serve as a purpose for, moistening small areas of skin.
This stuff works good.
Right, things like that, and topical, analgesic agents. But initially, we don't put anything on a burn, all right? Because we don't wanna hold the heat in. The only thing we wanna do is we wanna cool that site. So we're going to try and cool them off. If we respond to a burn and it's in that time period immediately following, anytime within like 10 minutes or so of the time of the initial incident, we still need to be focused on cooling. Now, we're talking about that, but let's go back to what we said about the body and regulating temperature. So, first thing we'll say is, kid grabs, puts his hand on the hot stove. We'll keep going back to that. That's a good, easy one and something you'll go to, because, kids don't know about it. They reach up on the top of the stove, they lay their fingers on it. That's a small, isolated area. I'm gonna do everything I can to continually cool that. The other thing that I'm gonna do is how would we, once we bandage that wound, how would we bandage that? So we've cooled it off, mom put it under, she didn't use anything she wasn't supposed to, she just put it under the sink, she ran cold water on it, now we've showed up on scene, how would we bandage that? So it's just on the kid's hand, and we'll even say it's second degree burns. He's got second degree burns.
Well,
He
you
didn't-
can wrap it with a sterile.
Okay,
Mhm.
we're gonna wrap it with,
Loosely, though. You don't
okay,
wanna wrap it too
but are we
tight.
gonna use dry or wet? Why?
You don't want to lose the moisture.
Right, so if it's dry, we run the potential of, if there's any break in the skin, or as plasma soaks through, if there's any oozing or seepage from the skin, then it will bind to that, and when we remove the gauze, it pulls it off. So, that's appropriate up to a point, because we said that with deeper burns, we start to lose that ability to regulate our temperature, right?
So you don't want to put with,
Right, so
That's
we
fine.
can absolutely cause more damage by hypothermia, if we apply wet dressings on a large surface area. Generally, where we move from a minor burn into, and it depends on the age, the person's, other health background, but primarily, we can say for adults, about 10% is where we progress out of it being minor and move into moderate, and after 20% is considered severe. And again, that can change a lot based on, obviously, children are more
diabetes don't make
susceptible.
that horrible.
What's that?
Diabetes,
Yep.
oh my God.
So diabetes, because it affects, circulation at the capillary level, it affects nerve function, but also just being elderly, or being a child, being a small child. And I know this is kind of deviating off just a little bit, but why would somebody elderly, and we're not even talking about other health concerns, we're not talking about any other
Because
medical
their
problems.
veins are sensitive. Their veins are brittle. and
So, not even their veins, it's the skin.
Skin, yeah.
The skin, so they lose the elasticity in their skin. Their skin loses a lot of its function and its ability to regulate already. That's why a lot of times older people are more susceptible to temperature changes, things like that, is their skin doesn't work as well. It's like a car with 200,000 miles on it, you're not gonna go out and drag race that car just the same way you would something else. You're gonna be a little more gentle with it. Well, they start to lose a little bit of that function of their skin. It's not able to regulate everything as well as it could initially. The other thing is elderly people across the board always tend to be very dehydrated. They'll have poor skin turnover. You'll go up, you'll grab their skin, and it'll pull up, and it'll kind of tint. That lack of hydration and moisture makes them more prone to issues, but it also decreases the skin's ability to function regularly. So, if we get anything larger than 10%, we absolutely don't want to use a wet dressing. And because that wet dressing is going to cause them to lose so much heat that we way offset any counterproductive of the wound. Yes?
Even if it was just 10%, say I wrapped it, couldn't I wrap that thermal and just, or
Yes.
thickness with bandages or something to the
Yes,
extent that.
so you can, that's absolutely something you wanna do. You wanna do something to insulate them afterwards. However, depending on your region and different places have different protocols that go into a lot more detail as far as for where we draw that line between wet and dry. But as far as for a generic across the board registry purpose, they usually use 10% as kind of that differentiating point. Me personally, even at 10%, like, it's gonna depend on the individual, it's gonna depend on the environment, what type of weather it is, there's a lot of things we're gonna take into play. But
So after
just
10%,
kind of,
I can't imagine putting that much, like, if it's extensive, putting that much dry.
dry
bandage.
dress, yes, it sounds awful, it sounds painful, it sounds like it's a horrible idea. But the problem is if we put a wet dressing on them again, we're facilitating that heat loss. And
I'll
so,
just wrap them like a burrito at that point.
but even so, even if they're wrapped, if they're wet, remember, it's gonna allow that transfer out of the body tissue. Even if it's just transferring to the fluid that is surrounding their tissue, it's still loss of core temperature. So they still have to build that back up. So if I lose core temperature to just the wetness, even though it's still, even if you had an insulating layer around it, I have to regenerate that. Yes,
Never mind.
what?
I was gonna say, even if it's hot water,
So with that, there wouldn't be as much, but does hot water stay hot?
no, it's gonna cool off.
It's gonna cool off very quickly, and as it cools off,
It's gonna
your
process.
body's gonna transfer heat, because everything is always trying to balance. We know everything is always trying to balance out. That's the whole way that everything in our body works, is that homeostatic state of trying to make things equal. So, as bad as it sounds, when the burns get large enough, we do a dry sterile dressing on there. It doesn't mean that we can't irrigate wounds first, but we don't wanna soak our dressings before we put them on there. We wanna use dry sterile dressings because we don't wanna further facilitate them into hypothermia. Hopefully, when you guys went through your introduction to trauma, did y'all talk about, as far as with anything trauma related, did y'all at least say that the deadly dying, well, probably y'all's book, I know your book doesn't talk about the deadly dying, but at least the triad of trauma,
I wasn't here.
coagulopathy, hypothermia, and acidosis?
I've heard those words.
Okay, all right, then we won't get into that right now. That is something we'll talk about, so when we do our skills this afternoon, there's a couple other things we're gonna add on. Again, and they're just like big broad ideas to have in your mind going into trauma. But, just understand right now that hypothermia is very detrimental to any trauma patient whatsoever. And this is something that we're having to make positive changes about, because it's not something that's been pushed.
It's just forcing the body to burn out more ATP.
Yep.
to-
Where you're wasting lots of valuable. So, all right, we talked about, the layers of the skin, yes.
Real quick in regards to burns, are we still, we were using back in the day, and I saw some equipment, last time we were working in there, petroleum gauze?
So, we have petroleum gauze, a lot of times you can see that used for things that are, so we don't wanna put that on if it's recent burn. More so, you can see petroleum gauze used on, open injuries, things like that, like the skin, something that we don't wanna put wet. Petroleum is gonna prevent that binding of it. But if somebody's got a significant surface area, we just simply don't carry the quantity of petroleum gauze. And then the other thing is we do, I'm careful to say, yes, use petroleum gauze, because I don't want people to think that there's a big difference between that time initially after a burn and when we're trying to not hold heat in, and then we pass that point. That's why I say usually about 10 minutes is when, except in the instance of a grease burn where the heating agent is still present, or a chemical burn, but we'll get into chemical burns later. But other than that, after about 10 minutes is where we start to see that change, and then we can worry about insulating. So at that point, if I've got something small enough, yeah, I could utilize petroleum gauze. But anything large enough, I wouldn't consider petroleum gauze as an alternative to dry dressing on significant burns. But just because there's not enough volume.
So a small area, partial thickness, after 10 minutes. kind of thing.
Yeah,
That's your-
and generally, like I said, a lot of times we'll just use wet, sterile dressing.
Cheaper.
Well, it's the sterility of it. So that's one of the things that kind of plays into it. I mean, I'm sure cost does unfortunately play a fact in protocols, but, alright, so we talked about the layers of the skin, we talked about the function of the skin, we talked about as far as burns, first degree, second degree, third degree. I will use the slide deck when we get to the actual calculations of surface area, only because it's more helpful to actually pull up the visual slides that show the rule of nines. And then there's something different that's in y'all's book, that's a newer adaptation of the rule of nines, and we'll get to that. But there's a new formula. Now, it is not being used in the field right now, but it is something that at least is in the educational part that shows an adaptation of that, where you're taking things into consideration, like the patient's age, things like that. Used to be the only difference we did was on the rule of nines, you made a different calculation if it was a baby versus an adult, and that's just because their bodies are disproportionately sized. Generally, their heads are bigger. What's that? Yeah, it takes more value because it's larger on it, disproportionately larger. But before we get into those, let's move into, I want to talk about what they call fourth degree burns. Let's talk about electrical burns real quick. So first off, we're gonna talk about how electricity actually burns the skin, but then we're gonna talk about the other things that it does to the body as well. So when you turn on your stove, the eye glows red, right? I would say light bulb, but now most all the light bulbs are LED, but old school light bulbs, when you turned it on, it glowed because of that little filament in there, right? What makes the stove glow red? What makes it generate heat? It's electricity going through, but why does it get hot? Because the lines don't get, if just electricity traveling generated heat, then when we turn the stove on, wouldn't the power wires get super hot? Or if I turn the lamp on, wouldn't my power wire to the lamp get super hot? What makes the lamp glow? What makes the stove generate heat?
Material, the conduit?
Yes, the material, resistance. So a resistance, because what we're doing is we're taking a material that does not conduct the electricity as well, and so when it doesn't conduct electricity as well, it generates heat. So with the light bulb, we're glowing, but it's in a vacuum that doesn't have air to combust, and so it sits there and glows and generates that light. But light, if you put your hand here on a light bulb, you feel heat coming off of it. Well, the stove does the same thing. We're using something that doesn't conduct the electricity as well. It creates resistance. That resistance generates heat. So when we look at a electrical burn, what we're going to have is yes, you're going to have damage throughout because your body, there is going to be some resistance of that electricity traveling through your body, and so it's going to cause some damage, but the most severe damage that we will see as far as tissue-wise is going to be at the entrance and exit site. Why do you think that would be? Why would there be the most damage if I touching a wire, if I grab the wire for the dryer and I get a burn here on my hand real bad, and I get a burn on my foot where it exited real bad. Why is it worse on the surface?
Because that's where it was more hot.
It is more hot, but why is it more heat there?
where the
Because on the
conduction is.
surface it's cooler than the inside of your body.
So the same way that the stove gets hot, resistance. So our entire interior of our body is moist. It's all fluid based. So just like with everything else, we said fluid facilitates gas exchange, fluid facilitates temperature exchange, fluid reduces resistance. So electricity can travel through wet tissue a lot better than it can dry tissue. It has a lot of resistance when it's on the skin. So, you guys remember, way back when y'all first started, y'all played with the AED, right? When you did the CPR class? When you pull off the pads for the AED, they're what? They're sticky and gooey, right? That's to facilitate conduction. They have that so that the current will transfer through the skin much more easily. So unless, now if a person was wet, if a person, if this was something that they were covered in water, whatever, they may have less surface burns because their skin's gonna be a little more conductive. It's not gonna have as much resistance. But it's the resistance that causes those burns. So when you touch that on your hand, where it contacts on your hand, there is more resistance there, so it superheats the tissue just like your stove eye heating up. So that's why there's a lot more concentrated damage on the surface, but then as it gets into your body, the damage is gonna be lessened. Now, depending on the amount of current, your body can transfer some current through with no issue whatsoever. The way that we see this, if any current caused the damage, anybody remember the TENS unit? So it's the sticky pads they put on you like for muscle problems, like for back problems, things like that, and it sends a small little electric current. Yeah, it's a small electric current, and it's very similar to what your body actually generates through a sodium and potassium exchange. It uses the electrolytes to get that electrical current that causes muscle function, right? On the smallest level, when I bring my arm up and I put my arm down, that's because of a change in electrical ions, right? We're actually having that transfer. So your body can facilitate some, and it can accommodate some external. That's why we can use those things like the TENS unit that will stimulate your back muscles, things like that. And to a point, you can transfer through, I know I'm dating myself with this, but phone lines, when phones used to actually have to plug into the wall, and I made the mistake one time of holding the phone, putting the phone line in my mouth while I was trying to put stuff together, and shocked the crap out of my tongue because there's a current in there. But it didn't cause any damage, it just gave that, ooh, that hurt. So as we get into larger amounts of current, the more current going through, the more amperage there is, the less your body's gonna tolerate it, and the more tissue damage it can do. But we're always gonna see that exponentially on the surface. So, and a couple of things we take into account with that is based on, because our body musculature and everything else functions off of electricity, just like that TENS unit can stimulate your back muscles, you getting an electrocution can stimulate muscle response.
We used to
So,
have a refrigerator that used to shock us. When we open the refrigerator,
Oh, that's
it
not
used
good
to
at all.
shock us.
no, that's not good at all.
It used to hurt so bad, it's just.
That means that there was a wire inside the fridge that was grounding out on the frame. So as we're in lower amperage, it'll actually cause the muscles to constrict. So we reach a point, and I say low relative to like high voltage lines versus something that we would have like interior in your house, 220, things like that. 110 line's gonna hurt. 220, we start getting into things where it'll actually cause your muscles to constrict it down, and you run the risk of getting a shock as you get into those voltages and amperages that it'll cause the muscles to constrict, and it'll hold you on there and continue to send electricity through and do more damage. As we get into the really high ones though, it'll actually cause a flexation or an extension, and so it'll more so blast you off of it, but it'll also cause lots of tissue disruption. People that have lightning strikes, that's one that is gonna do lots of tissue damage at the entry point and exit point. The only thing that facilitates that is usually somebody struck by lightning is also out in the rain. And so that water can help out a lot in reducing the damage. But here's something we do have to think about. We said muscles function off of electrical activity, right? So what's one really, really important muscle in our body that functions? The heart. All right, so we know that as far as like the use of an AED, things like that, it's the purpose of an AED, and I know you guys, like this is EMT, we're not gonna get into paramedic, we're not gonna talk about heart rhythms and all that, but do we at least have an understanding that of the heart, every single piece of tissue in the heart the tissue is what's called automatistic. It means that every single part of the heart has the ability to function
right.
independently and constrict, right?
Mhm.
So what we need for the heart to function properly is a rank structure. So think of something like a military rank structure. You got one person up the top giving commands. He passes the word to the next man in line, he passes the word to the next man in line, and eventually it breaks all the way down and it's all the way out to the foot soldiers everywhere, right? And we need that rhythm, that flow. So you have your primary pacemaker of your heart that initiates it, and as it goes down, the atriums constrict, it passes through, there's a slight delay while it goes through the middle wall, and then the ventricles constrict as it comes all the way out around. So every time that the heart muscle constricts, it uses the electricity it had, and then there's a pause where it has to repolarize. So and like, again, there's a deep thing we could get into about sodium and potassium and the ions moving in and out, but the short version is it uses energy to constrict, and then it needs a pause to recharge before it can constrict again. The example I like to give people is, if you have to blow up a balloon, you take a deep breath in, and then you blow into that balloon, right? Well, kind of like when somebody gets the wind knocked out of you, it's really hard to exhale when there's no air in you, right? So it's not gonna be effective, you're gonna kind of gasp. If you tried to blow up a balloon and you didn't take a breath in, you're gonna struggle with it, right? So heart tissue is the same way, it needs to repolarize, it needs that break period. The reason we can utilize an AED will only treat one cardiac rhythm.
Arterial fibrillation.
What's that?
Fibrillation, arterial fibrillation.
Well, ventricular fibrillation.
Ventricular.
Ventricular fibrillation. So what's happening in ventricular fibrillation
They're not
is
in order.
everything's not in order. The heart's kind of quivering because nobody's following somebody's command. Every individual part of the heart is just saying, beat, beat. And so it's all screaming for attention at the same time, the tissue quivers. So when we use an AED, the purpose of that is to send a current through and we reset everything. We fire everything at one time, and the hope is that then whoever, like the pacemaker will kick back in because it forces everything. Now, the reason that works is because the law of averages would say that if the entire heart is quivering and we randomly fire a hit through at one point, half of them are gonna be in the recharge state, right? Just the law of averages would say that. So what we hope is that by firing it through, that there's enough there that's charged up that we can at least get that first beat. It's kind of like when your battery in your car is struggling, but it's like you're rolling it over and it ring, but if you at least kick over and start, then you're good. So same process with your heart. The problem with an electrocution, with a electric injury, is that it causes everything to fire just like that AED would, if the path travels through the chest cavity. Now, if you touch something here and here, great, it's gonna take the path of least resistance, it's gonna go from there. But normally it's gonna be going from a hand all the way down to a foot, or from one hand to another hand, which allows path through the chest cavity. So if that electricity passes over the heart, where your heartbeat is at is going to determine how bad the damage is. Because if it happens to hit you at the point that your heart is just recharged and it's ready to fire again, no big deal, right? Current goes through, fires off, causes your heart to beat one time, and you're okay. But what if that current passed through at the time that your heart had just fired and was getting ready to repolarize?
Oh, man.
It continues to try to contract, and it's you trying to blow up a balloon after you just completely exhaled, all right? It doesn't work, and so what it does is it causes the heart to be in a long delay of constriction that makes individual parts of the heart all start screaming, and what it does is it puts them into ventricular fibrillation. The same reason that when we're shocking somebody, when we learn CPR, we said we make sure everybody's clear, right? Because we don't want it to hit you randomly wherever you are. So, what we have to think about with electrical burns is that there's the potential for that. So in that instance, it is more important to address the cardiac function first before we worry about any burn damage. Because what good are we gonna do for treating burns if their heart's not beating? All right, at that point it doesn't matter. The other thing is from a standpoint, especially from a standpoint of an EMT in in the field environment, or even a paramedic in the field environment, we've got a limited time window. Even though the heart was already totally constricted down and it fired at that perfectly wrong time and threw them into VFib, their heart, there's still the potential for a little while, because each one of those cells is burning up the available fuel that it has, and it has the ability to constrict. And so there's a grace period that if we were to hit them with a defibrillator, that we can reset it, hopefully, and put them back in. But the longer they're in that, the more that tissue starts to struggle, the less likely you're gonna be able to convert them. And we have to have VFib to shock them. Because unlike Grey's Anatomy and every other TV show, we don't shock assistantly, right? You know, when on TV, they'll shock them again and again and again, and it's a flat line and they get it back. If you're shocking a flat line, doesn't do anything because there's no electrical activity. You have to introduce something to create that activity. But anyway, so when it comes to electrical burns, make sure that if it's something that, if they have gotten to that point, utilize an AED first. So, let's back up a little bit, and let's look at all of these now. 1st degree, 2nd degree, 3rd degree, and 4th degree electrical burns. The biggest consideration we need to have with any one of these, let's fall back to, and I harp on this as far as for every single assessment, because this is everything that registry is based off of, this is what your tests are based off of, your skill assessment, and real world functioning, is that rapid trauma assessment sheet you guys learned, or the medical scenario sheet. They're, the first 5 on that are identical. Hopefully you guys have committed some of that to memory, but what's the very first thing? BSI. What's the second thing? Seen is safe. So, if somebody suffered an electrical burn, we need to make sure that there's not still the potential that whatever caused it is not still present. We need to be concerned about that, a safety standpoint from us. Everything needs to be safety oriented. If the person has a thermal burn, if they were burned by a fire, obviously, you know, we're looking at safety concerns as us. We want to remove the individual from that environment where they're receiving the burns, but not at the expense of introducing ourselves to that. So, realistically, response-wise, things like that, if somebody, anything other than electrical burns, somebody's either going to self-extricate from that situation, be rescued by somebody else, or they're gonna succumb to their injuries. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. By the time somebody calls 911, units are dispatched, you get out there, you know, if that was their initial injury, that's not what you're gonna be treating them for. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't be called out for a car wreck, but at some point, the car catches on fire and you arrive and find them currently receiving burn injuries. So yes, we do want to remove them from that if we can. And there's a whole thing, when we get into vehicle extrication and all those things, we'll talk about priorities as far as when it becomes what we call a snatch and grab, load and go, something that you risk spinal stabilization and other things and further injury, to go ahead and just yank them out and get them out of that environment. But we always need to be concerned about our safety first. But electrical burns is where that's gonna not be. It's pretty simple. If you walk up and you see a car on fire, you know the car is on fire. Your brain registers the threat of that. You're going to make safety concerns. You're going to make changes for it. If you come up and somebody's just been pulled out of a house fire, your brain registers the threat that's present. Electrical burns, we don't always get that. Electrical burns, it may be you respond to one down. You know, how many times do we go to drunks or a bum that's just sleeping on the bench, things like that. So our guard is down when we go to something that doesn't give us that indicator. Now, obviously, if we see a telephone pole broken and wires on the ground and sparks popping, something like that's gonna clue us in. But what happens when you get the guy that they called because, oh, this guy's laid out, we saw him laying in the grass next to the neighbor's house? Well, what you don't know is that this guy was trying to steal copper out of the AC unit and ended up grounding out one of the 220 lines on the ground, and the ground was energized right there because he was trying to steal the copper wires. So we have to take things like this into consideration, and that's where, when we get into and we talk about doing our scene surveys and our tightening circles, things like that come into play. We've kind of got off track on that a bit, but I just wanted to emphasize on the safety aspects as far as electrical burns. Other type of burns that we need to talk about real quick, we'll talk about chemical burns, and then we'll talk about radiation. Well, you know, we'll hit radiation first because it's easier. Radiation burns are simpler and shorter, then we'll talk about chemical burns. So when we talk about radiation burns, we're not talking about radiant heat, that sort of thing. That's still a thermal burn injury. When we talk about radiation burns, we're specifically looking at as far as alpha, beta, gamma radiation, things like that. There's not a lot of potential for that normally out in everyday environment.
That point, you're just breaking up cell structures.
Right. So short of somebody in some sort of, you know, that for whatever reason is in a location where they're involved with hazardous material management, things like that, that's not really something that we're gonna see very prevalent. There is absolutely the potential that you could see it in a mass casualty type of incident because people can utilize lower grades of things, with multiple casualty incidences, things like that. Somebody trying to do some kind of weapon of destruction. But short version, just to try and think and understand the process, you know, we've talked about the stove and the oven and things like that. Let's talk about your microwave. So, how does a microwave warm up food?
Heating up the water.
Heat wave.
Okay.
Water content, you know.
It's
Microwaves.
electricity too, first of all, let's say that.
So there's electricity that
Then there's
runs
light.
it, but the electricity doesn't actually do it. So the electricity just runs a radio transmitter. And that radio transmitter, even though that's not nuclear radiation, that's not alpha, beta, and gamma radiation, it is a radio wave, but it causes the water molecules to move faster, which causes heat to be generated, and it works from the inside out. When microwaves were first introduced, when they came out, nobody really understood the technology at the time, and there were lots of people that got cancer from microwaves because there was guys in, there was one case study in particular of a guy that worked at a restaurant in California, and they were one of the first restaurants to use a microwave for food prep. And what he did was he decided it took too much time to open the door and close the door, and he needed to be able to hold the dishes. So he took the door off of his microwave, and that way he could set a dish in, do his stuff, and then reach in and grab the dish and pull it out with using both hands. And the guy started getting, he ended up with burns, radiation burns to his hands, but he also ended up with cancer, and he obviously got very sick and died from this in a very short period of time. There was also a case study of an elderly woman that decided to dry her poodle, her little miniature poodle, in her microwave because it would heat him up and dry him off quicker. People didn't understand this. You know, but radio waves can cause that. And one thing in particular that we do have around here, if anybody ends up working anywhere out on Fort Benning, radar. So radar is a radio wave, and the stronger variants of radar will actually do the same thing. They've got a couple of airborne radar devices that they cannot turn on the ground, or they kill the foxes, rabbits, rats, and everything else out of the runway. So, you know, that is one potential that you could run into something for a radiation burn. So don't think it just has to be nuclear radiation. It can be something that's just any radio wave, any wavelength passing through. All right, so before we break, let's move to chemical burns, all right? So chemical burns are a completely different entity. We still, number one, we're putting our safety first, and then we're trying to get that person out of that environment. Well, chemical burns, it's a little different when we're removing them from that. So what we need to do is obviously if we knew what was on them, that would be helpful, but in the era of not knowing, there are a couple of things out there, yes, that can react violently to water, and water can make things worse. But as a whole, the great majority of things are not going to be made worse by water. So it is okay to use copious amounts of water to wash whatever it is off of them. However, we know what? If we get them wet, it causes more absorption, right? So let's get anything off of them dry that we can before we get them wet. So yeah, have them, we can brush it off, if I can have them brush it off. But, all right, well, now we're brushing off dry stuff, what does that do? Makes dust, gets stuff in the air, they breathe it in, we breathe it in. So now we're brushing them off, and we're actually, now, of course, currently, everybody's wearing masks, and they supposedly work so great, so we would like to think that would stop it. But, let's be real. If somebody's got some kind of dry chemical on them, we need to be concerned about respiratory protection, and we want to brush things off them, but we do want to get as much off of them as we can prior to them flushing everything off of them. So little things to think about. Guys carrying a bag, we'll just say, everybody likes to use Lime, because that one's a real good, easy one to go to, and because it's something that's readily available. If bag busts, he gets it all over his shirt, it's on his arms.
Oof.
We want to get this off of him, right? We want him to brush it off of him, but we also, it's all over his shirt. Don't be the guy that says, okay, let's pull your shirt off over your head, and let's just run this all over your face, in your hair. We cut it. And how would we cut it?
Right from the back and then just push it off of them.
Exactly, so from the back, start at the top of the neck and cut downward, and that way you can start to peel it away. You can even cut and do the sides as well. So if we can cut and lap it down, if I can cut down here and down here, I think you said side, you said back, either one of those, perfect. Because as long as I can lay the clothing away from them, and I start here and cut so that I can pull everything away, but cut that clothing, pull the clothing away, let them brush anything downward and away. If they can do it, great. My thing is, this person's already been exposed to it. If they can do it themselves, sure. If not, then I can do it, but it's easiest to go ahead and do that. And again, we're in an odd time right now, but we would always encourage people to wear respiratory protection while brushing anything off. So we brush it off, what's that?
Micro too.
Yes, eye protection too. So that's the next thing we're gonna talk about is what happens if some kind of chemical agent gets in the eye. What's the good generic go-to that every single package on it says, if you read on there, like you're reading the warning label and it says, flush with water for 5 minutes, flush with water for 15 minutes, flush with water for 20 minutes, whatever the case may be. That's the general go-to, is flush the eyes. So if you look in here, in your book, there's a picture that shows somebody laying there, and he's got a bottle that's about the size of that Dasani bottle, because that's the way your sterile water and your normal saline is packaged. And they show that pouring it on this person's eye, and they say, flush continuously for 20 minutes. Number one,
With what?
that bottle's gonna run out in about 20 seconds. 30 seconds if you're conservative, right? Maybe we can trickle really slow, but that doesn't work, all right? We need a way to continuously do this. So, first off, if you are somewhere, if you're at any industrial facility, if this is not, Bob the Builder doing stuff at his house, if this is something at a place, they're going to have eye wash stations available. So with that, you have a continuous supply that also has a shield that protects, that keeps it in an isolated area, and a drainage system to collect it. Use that. If they're not having, now obviously if this person's in respiratory distress, they're going into shock for some kind of other injury, some other associated thing, then that takes precedence and we do want to transport them. But if this person just had something that got in their eyes, use their eye wash station at work. That's gonna be the best thing we have available. Yes, are we delaying transport, but we're removing the product, and that's more important. So, yes.
With decon, at what point do we put the patient's health over the risk of contamination?
What do you mean, contamination of?
They say they've still got some of the substance on, but they've deteriorated to a point where this is a load, we gotta get them out.
So you have to make that on an individual basis. There are times, there are people that have transported and they've ended up having to take they've had to take the truck out of service because they ended up exposing stuff into the ambulance. It's an individual basis. That's something that you're just gonna have to make that judgment call. It's gonna depend on what the substance is. Are we talking about,
I guess.
what's that?
Call MD, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, when in doubt, reach out to medical control. but, which obviously the hospital's gonna not want you to bring anything into there that they can keep out. But, yes, more so it comes down to, it reaches a point of like something like that, if it's, we're worried about, if they're having respiratory difficulty, I'm gonna be more focused on, let me get them transported where we can get a definitive airway, because unfortunately, this is Georgia, and they don't allow in the field rapid sequence intubation.
Level 1, level 2s will have decon centers, right?
They don't allow what?
You to intubate somebody who's conscious. There's something that can be done in the field where you sedate somebody, you intubate them in the field, and you secure an airway before they lose it. But, Georgia does not allow you to do that.
Only non-responsive.
Right. So Georgia doesn't allow you to give the drugs to facilitate that. So Georgia wants you to wait until they actually completely lose their airway and it's swollen all the way shut and there's nothing you can do about it. Then you can try to intubate them. But, off that soapbox, so let's go back to the eye. So what can we do? What's a realistic way? And you won't find this in your book, so I don't expect you to know this. But I just want you to brainstorm for a second. So you've got somebody you need to transport. You've got let's say we've got, we'll use hydraulic fluid. So we've got an older man, was running his tractor out on his farm, and we'll just say we're in Talbot County or Marion County, and one of the lines broke, and he got sprayed in the face with hydraulic fluid. Now we've
Water
got,
hose,
what's that?
maybe a water hose.
Okay,
You know.
but, I mean, we can either sit there on scene with the water hose, but we wanna go ahead and get him transported, because hydraulic fluid's not good stuff. And hydraulic fluid, even though we can irrigate, it's gonna take continuous irrigation to get hydraulic fluid out of his eyes. And he may have had, depending on how the line busted, he could have penetrating hydraulic fluid injuries, and he needs immediate medical attention for something. But I want y'all to brainstorm with what you know of that's available in a truck. Just anything in the truck, whether it's within your scope or not.
Saline,
Okay,
Syringe.
all right, so how long is that syringe gonna last?
not long at all,
Syringe,
like
you can get
5
this
seconds.
kind of slow and controlled and direct point of pressure.
Okay, so,
to kind of flush
that
it
is the
out.
absolute first thing you'll do, is use a syringe. In particularly, even as a basic, you're not starting IVs, there's gonna be saline flushes available on the truck. Saline flushes give you something that is, it's a clean, concentrated force that you can push down and you can focal and you can push down. And what you need to be concerned of is it spraying back. Don't be too close to it yourself and try to squirt it at an angle so it kind of washes off and away. We always want to wash away from the bridge of the nose to the outside so it runs off versus rolling over into the other side. But, so a saline-filled syringe is perfect because it gives us a good concentrated first wash to push everything out. Now, we've got to continue to flush those eyes for 15 to 20 minutes. How do we do that?
IV bag.
All right, so IV bag. Now, how does that work?
You
How can
just, cut it, maybe the line, and just let it drain and maybe push it.
You are so close.
Stick a straw on the top of it so oxygen can push down and
Or
then
you
you
can
spray
put a
it.
hole in the bag.
No, you cut the IV line is perfect. But if I'm cutting the IV line, I'm only getting it on one side, right?
Okay.
Plus, I'm having to sit there and hold that, and I need to do other patient care, so what else could I do? And yes, I could tape it down to his forehead, but I'm still only getting one eye.
What if you tape it to his forehead sideways and then put 2 holes?
What's something else we have on the truck? For oxygen administration,
Nasal
Oh.
we have a nasal cannula. So,
Okay, yeah.
we take a nasal cannula, you cut the nasal cannula, and you cut it right at the point, after it comes from the tube back into one, and the interior of a nasal cannula will fit on the end
IV
that
line?
You cut the IV line.
Oh,
So,
it does.
you can squish that into there, hang your bag, let gravity control it, and still use your drip set controller to adjust the flow rate. But you put that around with the 2 cannulas coming right down into the bottom of their eye, and now you can let that bag sit there and run, and you're gonna continually flush their eye for 15 to 20 minutes with normal saline, completely hands-free, and allow you to do all the rest of your patient care. Again, you're not gonna find that in your book, but if you get the opportunity to do something in the field, even if you're a basic and you can't start IVs, there's probably gonna be IV fluid on the truck.
That's dope as
Tell
shit.
your paramedic, tell your whoever else is riding with you, hey, this will work, let's do this. you know, put it together and show them, and they're probably gonna be amazed and then go to the hospital and take credit for it. But, little things like that we can actually do something and make a difference. So think outside the box when it comes to these things. Kind of like you were talking about using petroleum gauze. Look for other options for stuff that you've got to get these things accomplished. Let me flip through this just to make sure we haven't, we talked about the skin, I'm not worried about the case studies. We talked about the layers. We talked about the function of the skin. I'm gonna hit on the kidneys in just a second. Actually, yeah, so, glad I saw that on there. So we talked about the damage to the skin. We talked about it affecting the skin being able to do its job. What I didn't talk about, we talked about hypothermia, all that, is, so when it damages that skin, those actual cells, the cells die, what happens? They start to rupture, they start to weep out. So what we end up with is a whole lot of extra waste. And we know, again, everything comes back to that balance, and hopefully y'all are really familiar with the acid-base balance system at this point, the pH scale. Normal pH for a human. Okay, at some point, very soon, we will have a class on that. The reason being is that the body has a particular point that it needs to exist at within the pH scale, and every single medical thing that goes wrong, regardless of what it is, what kills you is the variation in that pH. And everything we do in the field, at any level, is trying to get that back to that state. And that's even in the hospital setting, that's everything. Everything we learn, and if you understand the pH scale, you'll understand what's going on with diabetes, ketoacidosis, like every injury, every medical problem, you can associate as a variance in that pH, and then your efforts to get it back right. And understanding that, instead of you guys having to learn and memorize associated signs and symptoms, if you understand that pH system and how all that works, you're not memorizing stuff anymore. You know, when you look at it, you go, oh, well, in diabetes, this person creates excess sugar, so they have excess acid, and their body's going to try and get rid of it. So this person's going to present in this way. Once it gets this hot or this high, they're going to try and get rid of it other ways, and they're going to present this. This person's going to be super thirsty. They're going to pee all the time because their body's trying to flush everything out. They're going to be breathing deep and rapid because they're trying to blow off that carbon. So you're not memorizing signs and symptoms, you're understanding how every single thing works, and so then you can answer the things for yourself. So we will absolutely put a little into the pH, but for right now, understand that when cells are functioning improperly, when they're functioning without good oxygenation and good circulation, they're creating excess acid, right? We start to move into an anaerobic metabolism without oxygen, but at any point, anything that we're doing, any function without good circulation, we're creating excess waste. Then on top of that, if we actually have cell damage to the point that cells rupture, and we have lysembiosis, if everything starts to weep out, we end up with excess waste. So now we've got a lot of extra acidosis to deal with. We've got a lot of waste product that needs to be filtered out of the body. How does the body filter it out? Through the renal system. The kidneys filter all of that out. So how do the kidneys filter that out? Well, because our circulatory system moves everything throughout the body, and then our body uses fluid that we've consumed to urinate and to pass all that stuff out. Because again, we said fluid facilitates transfers of things more easily, so your body uses fluid to remove all that waste. So if somebody's got burned, number one, we have to look at the fact that we said all that acid's been produced into there, but what do burns do? They blister and they weep, right? Because when the cells rupture, they lose, the body sends plasmas to that area, everything is released. Those people ooze, they lose a lot of fluid. So now they're hypovolemic. So now what we've done is we've told the kidneys that not only do they have to work twice, 3 times, 4 times as hard to get rid of waste, but we're gonna give you a quarter of the fluid volume that you normally have to get rid of waste. So it would be like your boss coming in and saying, I don't know, whatever job y'all do, and I'm just gonna say, you know, you make sandwiches at Subway. and your boss comes in and says, I'm sending everybody home but you, and by the way, we're gonna make 4 times as many sandwiches now. Like, that's what happens to your kidneys in effect. And so it puts a tremendous load on the kidneys. They're trying to filter out, they don't have enough circulatory volume to do it, and so this person ends up going into kidney failure, and they die from this. It's the acidosis that kills them. It's that variance in the pH because their body's not able to get rid of it. So these people are going to need fluid. Now, at a basic level, no, we're not worried about doing burn calculations as far as for fluid replacement. When you guys get into the advanced portion, that's when we'll get more into that. You'll actually learn about how to calculate how much fluid they need based on burn surface area, things like that. But understand that anybody with a burn, a significant burn, is going to be hypovolemic. They're going to lose blood volume. They're going to lose that through the plasma, through that weeping out, and then they're going to be creating lots of excess waste. And again, it's a tremendous strain on the kidneys. The other thing is that when your body is struggling, when we become that hypovolemic and when you have that much waste, there's something that should have been covered in that initial introduction to trauma, as far as, has anybody heard the term of multi-organ dysfunction syndrome, MODS? Awesome, all right, at least somebody's heard of it, good. So the principle behind that being is that acidosis in being present in the body systemically is going to destroy multiple organs because your body has to start prioritizing body function. And then on top of that, we add to that not only is this person acidotic, but they've lost that fluid volume. Other things that are going to be affected is the gastrointestinal tract, because your body, y'all have already covered sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, right? Okay, so we know that we have one that is our dedicated for fight and flight, and the other one is feed, breathe, and sleep, right? Okay. So, yeah, rest and digest, however you want to. So your body's going to start prioritizing functions, and one of the things to go is circulatory to the gastrointestinal system. So now your GI tract is functioning with less circulatory volume. It's going to start to suffer from it. On top of that, you're not in processing the nutrients that you need to do cellular repair. So we end up with gastrointestinal damage. So when these people get large burns, even though we may treat them right now for that burn, and we're worried about that, we need to understand that this person has a very, very long road ahead of them because we've got to be concerned about kidney function. We've got to be concerned about gastrointestinal. Another thing we didn't hit on while we're talking about other body systems, let's talk about respiratory. So if kid puts their hand on a stove, I'm not worried about respiratory. If guy grabs a tailpipe, I'm not worried about respiratory. Obviously, with chemical burns, we would think there's the potential that they could have inhaled it, so there's problems like that. But let's just talk about thermal burns. Let's talk about fire, something, heat-related things. So if somebody's in a fire, fires aren't clean. Unless this person got burned by a fire that was entirely made of them just burning, they were burning wood outside, and there was nothing but natural products in it. And then even still, it would have to be good, clean, complete combustion. But most of the time when people are burned, it's in a car or a house. And everything is made of what? Plastic, synthetic fibers. So when all of this stuff burns, some of the worst things out there in the world for you to breathe in come from the decomposition and the burning of the foam padding insulation that you find in couch cushions and mattresses. And they don't burn complete, and it's not a good combustion, so they create a heavy smoke, so there's heavy particulates in the air, and it has all of these things that are not only long-term carcinogens, but immediately, we're talking about things like cyanide, all right? There's gonna be very high concentrations of this. So there are massive, massive toxins that this person has probably breathed in from whatever was burning them. But let's think more. Let's even narrow it down and let's just talk about thermal. So if I'm in somewhere and it was hot enough to burn me, the air in there was probably hot. So I'm breathing in superheated air, and so the damage that, just like you see damage to the skin, we see damage to the lung tissue. But we already know that if things are moist, things conduct more easily, right? So we can actually have a transfer of this, we can burn lung tissue more easily than we can exterior because your lung tissue's moist. The heat transfers from that superheated air into your lung tissue much more easily. So you can
And
have
it's gonna try to
more
go there
damage.
'cause it's least
Yep.
resistant.
So you can have more damage to your lungs than what you see visible outside. So we look for indicators. We look for things like soot around the lips, things like that. If somebody's got facial burns, in particular, so I know that there are some registry questions out there that will give you a scenario of somebody that was burned. One of them, in fact, there was a registry question that was something to the effect of, it's like you respond, the guy, he was in his apartment, the apartment caught on fire, he was escaping his apartment, and he jumped off the balcony. So now you arrive and he's laying there on the ground, and it's like the thing that you are most concerned about.
Secondary.
And it's gonna give you, the fracture of his arm or something like that. It's gonna talk about, the burns, to his hands, the cuts on his hands from breaking the glass, and then maybe there's one that's like the facial burns. And what you're most concerned about, or what is most life-threatening, is the facial burns, because that's indicative of breathing in superheated air that can burn the lungs more severely than what we see. So when lung tissue burns, so we know that the skin will dry, harden up, we know it pusses and oozes. Imagine if your lung tissue lost its elasticity. Your alveoli sacs lost the ability to expand and contract. Then it starts to ooze and pus, so now we cover that surface area. Well, fluid does facilitate, the natural moisture does facilitate oxygen and carbon exchange, but if we've got pus and surfactant, if we've got a buildup of stuff covering it, it inhibits that transfer. So now you've got lung tissue that can't expand and contract, and it can't facilitate the gas exchange. And if we don't have capillary level circulation in it, the blood's not even making it there in the first place to even start doing the gas exchange. So this person, absolutely, this is a life-threatening injury. This is something that if they don't receive medical attention, and even with medical attention, depending on the severity of it, there may or may not be something that can be done for them, depending on just how severe that damage is. But what we can do is what? We can super oxygenate, we can over oxygenate the air that they are breathing in. So why do we do that? So this guy, he's breathed in, he's got some lung damage. Why do we put him on a high concentration of oxygen? What does that do?
Because you wanna stop shock from going on, you wanna get
Okay,
that
what
oxygen.
does a higher concentration of oxygen do?
It's gonna allow gas exchange, and on the cellular level,
Okay.
on the.
So now. Give me a second.
It's gonna help to prevent.
Alright, so anytime we have any kind of gas exchange, whether this is in your lungs, whether this is anywhere, let's see, I'll tell you what, I'll put it on this side so we can, alright, so anytime we have everything, y'all are comfortable with osmosis and diffusion?
Yes.
Okay, the transfer of things over semi-permeable membranes. Right. So if we've got, and we'll say, normally you've got, and just to make up some even stuff, we'll say there's 6 oxygen in the air you breathe in, and we'll say there's 6 carbon in here that we're trying to get out. Well, everything, just like we said, everything's always a balance. Everything's always trying to even out. So when we breathe in, normally we'll get 3 of these oxygen over here. Now,
Oh, so we got a lot of waste, so if we over oxygenate, we can get rid of waste faster.
well, so real quick, so when we breathe in, and there's always, we don't use all the oxygen. We know, we breathe in at 21%, 20.9, we exhale between 17 and 19%, depends on the individual workload, whatever. But we know that there's still some oxygen present, right? So everything's trying to even out. So if we've still got some in here at this point, then we can say, okay, we're not gonna really move that many over. More so we're gonna get 2 over here, 1 may try to come back. So everything's trying to balance out. Well, if we introduce something that instead has all oxygen, and we've got in here the same amount of carbon, maybe even a little extra because of, having whatever injury. Number one, this is gonna make carbon come across a whole lot more easily, because now, instead of trying to balance out to whatever's here, say there was already 3, instead of it trying to even out, half of whatever is here can come over, right off the bat. Half of whatever's present is gonna move, half of the carbon is gonna leave, because it's got the availability for it. Half of the well, depending on whatever they've got, but we can get a larger portion of oxygen moved over. But what we gotta understand is, delivering oxygen is important, but removing carbon dioxide is way more important than delivering oxygen. Because it's removing that waste, it's keeping us at that good acid-base balance where we need to be. So if we provide them with highly oxygenated air, yes, it facilitates them getting more oxygen to the tissue, but more importantly, we're encouraging carbon transfer over when they exhale. So that helps us to offset all that. All right, we talked about respiratory, we talked about that. Let's see. We talked about those. There's some pictures of different burns.
Oh, wow.
So, there was a guy transported from Marion County that got so drunk that he fell asleep in the fire, burned his feet, and I have no idea how you were so drunk that you were passed out and slept through your feet burning. But
I've
you
seen it.
burned to the bone.
Oh, wow.
Like there was just bone tissue. He ended up with an above the knee amputation, but I have no idea if that's even possible.
He was drugged, he was on some heavy.
So this is what we were talking about, when I'm saying like the general go-to, and yes, there's a lot of other things that play into it as far as, if we get, elderly or young, but 10% is kind of that good go-to in your head to think about as far as the differentiating point from a minor to a moderate burn, and then anything above 20 is obviously major. That's what we're gonna be concerned about, something being life-threatening.
Oh, that was a burn. I thought it was,
It's a chemical burn.
So that can just be soot. The hair
Oh, okay.
follicles are gonna capture soot.
yeah, that's.
Oh, lungs.
Mhm.
So, we already know assessment, let's see. So when it comes to heat irrigated, if you've got a burn that is burn tissue, we wanna get we talked about removing the heat, we absolutely wanna remove whatever that source is, but if somebody's clothes are burnt to them, there's a careful area if we don't wanna cause more tissue by ripping everything off, but if there's still heat relative in that cloth, we wanna get that cloth off there. Also, it's not a clean product.
Right.
So, if we can get it wet, we can remove that, but if it's to the point that skin removes with the clothing, don't continue any further, particularly somebody you get in a house fire, because their skin will get to a point that when you try to move them, the skin will just come off in your hands. It's not very pleasant. Let's see, yeah, so this is what we were talking about before, about that if it's a small enough surface area, you can use a moist dressing, but again, moist dressings cause hypothermia, and we really wanna focus on keeping the patient warm.
Really make sure, white.
So, why did they do that right there?
You don't want the skin to fuse together.
Yeah, exactly. So we put the dressings in between to separate the digits.
What was that beyond?
It was just somebody, if they've got, yes, saying that you can put the dry dressing there and wrap around to secure it over their eyes. Chemical burns. So there's our guy right there. So, now if she's brushing either one,
I don't like her technique.
number one, nobody has any respiratory
Right.
protection on. Number
You
two,
should took them gloves
is she
off.
brushing it up towards him to spread it more onto him, or is
It
she
looks
brushing
like-
it down into his gloves?
Either
She
way, it's
should be
bad
bringing
because-
it down, but, it like she going up.
Either way,
But
she
you need
did.
to take them gloves off, man.
She could be doing that from the side, so it's going away from both
Yep.
of them.
Yep, and she could put his hands lower down, like there's a lot going wrong.
Her
there. Like I
technique's
said,
not
nobody
good.
has any respiratory protection on, she has no eye protection on. I love that she's got this full, like, $300 coat on and no eye protection.
You gotta spend your money where you got it, man.
But, yeah, that's that picture. So how effective is that gonna be? Maybe
No,
initially.
she should've been down, facing downward, so.
Well, that's like
She is,
she's
she's
running
turned
it-
to the side.
Yeah, she's turned to the side,
Okay.
so it's running out. But again, we can initially hit with that, but you're not gonna continuously flush with just that.
Need
Alright.
some force.
We talked about electrical burns, the more resistance at entry and exit points.
Okay,
That's,
they're a little effective.
that's a contact point, that's where the line was.
There was an electrical burn?
Mhm.
Wow.
And in particular, the case study for that guy was he was stealing copper wire.
Right.
And,
That's what happened.
So let your partner go in front of you, I'm just fine.
I was about to say, just turn the power off.
Yeah, but if you get that call and no one reports it as an electrical thing, they just got a guy down in the yard.
Yeah, you're not gonna know, like you said, the ground is.
all right, you guys, take 5 minutes and